My name is Mark. I am 40 years old. I live in the state of Oregon. For 3 long years, I worked as a night shift security guard for a large corporate communications company. My specific job was to watch over a very remote radio transmitter site. Most people listen to the radio in their car and never think about where the actual signal comes from. The signals come from massive steel towers built far away from regular towns. The company I worked for owned a massive array of these tall towers deep in the heavy green pine forests today. My specific site was located at the end of a 10-mile dirt logging road. There was a tall chain-link fence, a small paved parking lot, a solid cinder block control building, and a massive steel radio tower that reached up into the dark night sky. The control building was my office. It was basically a concrete bunker filled with very old, heavy metal server racks and analog radio broadcast equipment. I worked completely alone from midnight until 8 in the morning. The absolute hardest part of the job was the intense physical environment inside that lonely small building. It was not just quiet out there, it was actually heavily oppressive. The massive radio transmitters run on very high voltage electricity. Because of the heavy power load, the entire concrete floor of the small building constantly vibrated. You could always feel a low, steady buzzing deep in the thick soles of your work boots. The stale air inside the dark room always smelled slightly like hot metal and burning dust. Along the thick concrete walls, there were rows of heavy metal panels completely covered in small, flickering analog dials and many glowing bright green computer status signal indicator lights. When you sit in a windowless concrete room for 8 solid hours, miles away from another living human being, the sensory deprivation starts to heavily mess with your normal brain. The constant low hum of the massive electricity becomes a physical weight on your head. You start to stare at the small flickering dials for way too long. The tiny green lights reflect heavily off the smooth metal surfaces. After a few short months working out there, the thick line between actual technical radio interference and your own internal auditory hallucinations begins to severely blur inside your tired, lonely mind. You constantly think you hear someone talking right behind you in the very noisy electrical hum. You turn around fast, and there is absolutely nothing there except the large gray metal server racks. It is just the sound of the raw, high-frequency power messing with your inner eardrums. You slowly tell yourself that it is just normal static. You quietly tell yourself you are just very tired. I completely believed that simple excuse for a very long time. I thought the job was just boring and loud. Then, the first truly unexplainable thing happened during my second year. It was a completely quiet Tuesday night in the exact middle of October. The sky outside was completely clear and free of any rain clouds. It was the absolute peak of the full lunar cycle. The large, bright moon was very intense, casting harsh white light across the empty dirt parking lot area. Inside the concrete control building, everything was functioning very normal. The heavy floor was vibrating just like always. The large transmitter racks were humming loudly. I was sitting at the main security desk. On my desk, there was a straight row of small, square audio monitors. These specific audio monitors are used to randomly check the actual live radio broadcast feeds to make sure the public audio is fully clear. There were exactly 4 monitors total on my wooden desk. 3 of them were turned completely on, showing small bright green lights. The 4th monitor, on the far right side of the wooden desk, was completely powered down. It was a broken secondary backup unit. It had a physical plastic power switch on the front panel that was firmly flipped down to the off position. The black power cord was completely unplugged from the wall. The black cord was resting, visibly, flat on the concrete floor. At exactly 2 in the morning, I was drinking hot black coffee and reading a local sports newspaper. Suddenly, I heard a very strange, faint noise. It was a soft, wet sound. It somehow cut right through the heavy electrical hum of the loud room. I put my old newspaper down slowly on the clean desk. I turned my head quickly to listen much closer. The unknown sound was definitely coming directly from the broken, unplugged 4th monitor on the far right side of my large, flat security desk. I leaned closer to the small metal speaker grill on the front. The sound was a human voice. It was not a normal loud radio broadcast voice. It was a very distinct, quiet whisper of a grown man crying. It sounded exactly like he was weeping softly and whispering random numbers over and over again in the dark. 4, 9, 2. The voice was totally filled with deep, genuine human pain. I sat back heavily in my black desk chair. My brain tried to logically process what I was looking at right now. A speaker cannot simply produce any sound. It cannot work without any electrical power. It is physically impossible. Yet the quiet weeping continued from the dark metal box. 4, 9, 2. I felt a very heavy, deep tightness in my chest. I reached out with my right hand and touched the flat top of the dark metal monitor. The cold metal was physically vibrating with the weird audio output. This was not a hallucination inside my head. The sound was completely real. I looked directly at the small digital frequency display screen on the smooth front of the completely dead power monitor unit sitting perfectly right there. Even though the unit had no attached power cord, the small square screen was glowing a very faint, sickly yellow color. The digital numbers on the screen read exactly 0.00. That is a completely non-existent radio frequency channel. It is pure dead air. Nobody can legally or technically broadcast on that blank channel. I quickly grabbed my open company radio logbook and a cheap plastic pen. I frantically wrote down the exact specific time and the weird short numbers the crying man was whispering slowly. The quiet weeping sound lasted for exactly 3 full long minutes. I just sat there silently and listened to it carefully. The pain in the strange unknown voice was deeply unsettling. It sounded precisely like a man who had completely given up all his hope of ever being found by anyone. After exactly 3 whole minutes finally passed, the yellow screen flickered twice and went totally dark again. The monitor stopped vibrating under my resting right hand. The quiet concrete room went completely back to the normal heavy hum of the high-voltage equipment. I did not go back to reading my paper. I spent the next 4 hours anxiously searching. I looked through the main computer database for any registered towers or amateur ham radio operators using that specific impossible frequency. I thoroughly checked the national mapping system we always use to strictly track local radio signal overlap. There was absolutely nothing. According to the completely accurate company mapping software, the true source of that specific radio signal did not exist anywhere on the entire planet. I felt a very cold, heavy feeling slowly settling into my stomach. Working totally alone in the dark woods, you rely very heavily on solid logic and standard operating procedures to keep yourself calm. You rely on the basic laws of physics entirely. An unplugged broken radio definitely does not turn on by itself. A completely dead, empty channel does not simply pick up the very clear sounds of a weeping man. I tried extremely hard to mentally justify the bizarre event. Maybe the long monitor power cord was acting as a passive antenna picking up a random stray bouncing signal from the high cold atmosphere. Maybe the bright full moon was causing some completely weird electromagnetic anomaly in the heavy metal room. But none of those weak logical excuses explained the extreme clarity. The sad, strange voice was totally clean. There was zero background static behind the spoken words. It sounded like the crying man was standing right behind me in the empty concrete room, whispering his numbers directly into my right ear. When the morning shift guy finally arrived to successfully relieve me at 8, I did not tell him about the completely broken monitor. I just quickly packed up my heavy metal thermos and walked outside to my car. I realized then that the massive radio tower was quietly catching horrible dark things hidden deep within the invisible electromagnetic spectrum tonight. After the strange radio incident, my fear shifted from the inside of the control building to the completely dark outside environment. The radio transmitter site was surrounded by a very tall chain-link perimeter fence. At the very top of the metal fence, there were 3 rows of sharp barbed wire. We had 4 large bright floodlights mounted on the 4 corners of the concrete building. The bright lights illuminated the small paved parking lot and the heavy steel base of the radio tower. But the light did not reach the distant dark tree line outside. The dense pine forest started about 50 feet past the tall perimeter fence. That 50-foot gap of completely dark grass was where the real physical problems started to happen. During my 3rd year on the lonely job, I started to notice tall, dark figures pacing back and forth in that specific dark grass area. I would look at the black and white security monitor on my wooden desk. I could clearly see the dark shapes moving just outside the bright reach of our large floodlights. They walked with a very heavy, dragging, and totally unnatural physical motion every night. One night in late November, I was watching the main security camera feed carefully. The camera was pointed directly at the heavy front automatic gate. The heavy gate rolls on a solid metal track and requires a secure electronic card to open. At exactly 3 in the morning, the heavy gate slowly rolled open by itself. The camera video feed showed absolutely no physical person standing near the electronic card reader. There was no mechanical failure alarm on my main computer. The large gate simply opened wide for a totally invisible visitor and stayed open for 5 minutes straight. I locked the thick concrete building door from the inside immediately. Then I started to hear the heavy footsteps. They were not walking on the dirt outside the tall fence. They were walking directly on the thick paved parking lot right outside my small solid building. The heavy boots made a loud scraping noise on the rough, wet asphalt. They slowly walked in a perfect wide circle right around the heavy steel base of the massive radio tower. The heavy scraping noise echoed loudly over the low humming sound of the massive high-voltage electrical equipment running inside my room. I walked over to the small reinforced glass window and looked outside. The exact moment I looked directly through the glass, the loud footsteps completely stopped. The paved lot was totally empty. The massive steel tower stood quietly in the bright floodlight beams. I stepped back from the cold window, and the heavy scraping footsteps instantly started walking again. They were playing a very sick psychological game with my tired mind. The dark figures knew exactly when I was looking at them. The heavy pacing continued for 2 entire hours until the morning sun finally started to rise up brightly. The extreme psychological toll of the lonely night shift started to ruin my normal daily life completely. When my long shift ended at 8 in the morning, I would drive 10 miles back to my small, quiet house, but the intense feeling of deep dread completely followed me home every single day. I could not sleep in my own warm bed. I developed a very loud, persistent ringing noise deep inside both of my ears. The loud ringing sounded exactly like the high-frequency hum of the massive electrical transmitter racks running inside the remote concrete control building at work. I was definitely not the only security guard experiencing these severe mental problems. The corporate company had a very high employee turnover rate for these specific isolated tower sites. Guards would suddenly quit the easy job after only 2 or 3 short weeks. I eventually found the old hidden daily logbooks from the previous night shift workers. They were stuffed away inside a dusty metal filing cabinet in the back corner of the room. I read their handwritten reports carefully. Every single guard reported the exact same weird equipment failures and highly unusual audio problems during their long, isolated shifts. Many of the older guards also heavily reported experiencing missing time. They would sit down at the main wooden desk at 2 in the morning to drink hot coffee. They would blink their tired eyes once, and suddenly the bright digital clock would read 5 in the morning. 3 entire hours of their quiet night were just completely gone from their human memory. The main security cameras during those missing hours would only show them sitting perfectly still in the black desk chair, staring blankly at the dark wall without blinking or moving a single muscle at all that night. The most disturbing secret report I found was from a guard named Paul. He worked the lonely night shift 5 years before I ever started. Paul wrote a very frantic final report before he quit his job forever. He wrote that he was doing his routine radio audio checks on the main computer monitor. He tuned the analog dial to a random blank channel to listen to the empty static noise. Suddenly, the loud static completely cleared up. Paul heard his own exact voice coming directly out of the metal speaker. The old radio was somehow broadcasting him right then. The voice on the dark radio was narrating Paul exactly in real time. The voice said he was reaching for his hot coffee cup. Paul was actually reaching for his cup right at that exact second. The strange voice said Paul was looking at the locked front door. Paul was looking at the heavy metal door. It was a completely impossible live broadcast of his own current reality. The massive tower was not just transmitting normal music signals out into the world. The tower was actively watching the isolated security guards and speaking directly to them in the dark room. I started to seriously question the true purpose of the massive steel monolith standing right outside my thick building. Were these extremely tall metal structures just passively attracting dark, invisible entities from the deep forest? Or were they specifically built to act as a direct physical bridge to something completely unknown? The company always built these tall towers in the most isolated, lonely locations possible. They always completely blamed strict local zoning laws for the remote locations. But sitting out there completely alone in the dark, I felt like the complete isolation was totally intentional by the huge corporate company. The deep vibration of the heavy concrete floor started to physically damage my own body heavily over time. My heavy work boots could not stop the intense shaking from traveling directly up my sore legs. I felt physically sick every single morning when I finally walked out to my quiet car. I would constantly find small, random drops of fresh red blood dripping slowly from my tired nose. The high-frequency radio waves were slowly cooking me completely alive inside that extremely small, thick concrete bunker. The massive company totally knew about the huge health risks to their human guards. My final piece of hard evidence came during my absolute last week on the job. It was a very cold night in early December. A massive winter storm knocked out all the main power lines leading out to the remote transmitter site. The massive electrical grid went completely dark. The backup diesel generator failed to start up properly. For the first time in many long years, the heavy concrete floor finally stopped vibrating. The loud electrical hum completely died. The massive tall steel tower was entirely dead and offline. The concrete control room was totally silent and very freezing cold. I sat in the completely dark room using only my small battery-powered flashlight for clear light. The quiet silence in the heavy concrete building was incredibly heavy and deeply uncomfortable. My own breathing sounded way too loud in the empty dark space. All the main computer screens were totally black. All the heavy metal radio broadcast racks were completely powered down. I waited patiently in the dark for the local power company to fix the broken electrical lines on the distant dirt road. I rested my tired head on the wooden desk and closed my eyes for a minute. Suddenly, the entire row of small square audio monitors on my wooden desk clicked very loudly. The small green power lights did not turn on at all. There was absolutely zero electricity running into the thick concrete building, but every single analog speaker cone started to vibrate heavily at the exact same time. The loud sound of harsh static filled the dark, cold room. It was not normal white noise. It was a very deep, aggressive, totally overwhelming static sound. It sounded precisely like a massive ocean wave crashing heavily directly inside the small locked control room area tonight. I quickly stood up and backed away from the large wooden desk. My bare hands were shaking very badly in the cold, dark air. The loud static noise slowly morphed into a very clear audio transmission. It was completely impossible. The giant steel tower outside was completely dead. The heavy transmitters inside were totally off, yet a massive signal was coming directly through the completely dead equipment. I listened closely to the loud audio transmission. It was not the quiet crying man from before. It was not my own personal voice narrating my physical actions inside the cold room either. The loud audio was a massive chorus of many different human voices speaking at the exact same time. There were hundreds of distinct voices overlapping each other heavily in the dark room. Some of them were screaming in pure terror. Some of them were crying very softly. Some of them were angrily yelling completely random long strings of numbers into the cold, empty air. The collective noise was completely deafening. I covered both of my ears tightly with my cold hands, but the loud, terrible voices seemed to vibrate directly inside my own heavy human skull bone, completely and deeply. I ran blindly toward the thick concrete building door. I fumbled heavily with the heavy metal deadbolt lock in the absolute pitch-black darkness. I finally forced the solid door open and practically fell outside onto the cold, paved parking lot. I ran directly toward my personal car parked near the tall chain-link perimeter fence. I did not look closely at the tall, dark grass outside the metal fence. I did not want to see if the tall, heavy shadow figures were standing out there watching me run away in absolute, total human panic and sheer, deep psychological fear. I threw my car into drive and completely sped down the long dirt logging road. I never returned to that remote transmitter site ever again. I sent a very short email to the corporate security manager the next day, completely resigning my position. I did not bother trying to honestly explain what had totally happened to me. They would just think I had completely lost my own rational mind due to the intense loneliness of the dark job. They would just quickly hire another new guy to sit out there entirely alone in the very dark, heavy pine woods area. I am totally safe now in my warm, bright house, but I still cannot bring myself to turn on the standard radio in my personal car. I simply cannot stand the tiny moments of dead air when switching between normal local channels. I always quickly wonder exactly what truly inhabits that totally empty, dead space. I always deeply wonder if the massive steel towers are still completely listening right now. I wonder exactly what is waiting inside the very loud static between the normal stations we tune into every single day. My name is Mark. Have a safe night. Goodbye.